Who really was Jack the Ripper, the Victorian serial killer who terrorized the Whitechapel area of East London in 1888 and was never caught? But that didn't mean he got clean away and lived happily ever after. So something stopped him, as serial killers never stop or retire. Or was he actually caught after all? Using some Sherlock Holmes-style lateral thinking, we can shine some new light on this old cold case and reveal who he might really have been. He had to have known the area well, to blend in, strike suddenly and get away, perhaps a local tradesman like a bootmaker, used to working with strong hands and cutting with sharp knives, so able to rapidly mutilate his victims. With a private workshop nearby to wash up unobserved, geographical profiling puts him living within walking distance of all the crime scenes. And far from looking like a crazed maniac, he probably looked like any ordinary local man, first chatting to his victims and posing as a harmless client. Although other murders could have been attributed to the Ripper, there were just 5 canonical or officially identified victims in a period from August to November 1888. He was originally titled The Whitechapel Murderer, or Leather Apron, but then a letter arrived at a news agency in September 1888 claiming to be from the killer. It was addressed to Dear Boss and signed Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. That and a later signed postcard were most probably the work of journalists working for a newspaper called The Star in an effort to boost sales. The name caught on, and other publications started using it. The police received hundreds of similar hoaxes at the time. Leather Apron was the title used by newspapers after the first canonical murder, perhaps just capitalizing on popular gossip that the killer was a mysterious local Jewish bootmaker who went by this name. And more sensationalist hysteria was whipped up by the press after a leather apron was found close to the body of canonical victim number 2. But it was just a popular working garment that had been washed and put out to dry, not a calling card placed by the killer. John Pizer was a local 38-year-old Polish Jew and slipper maker who was known by the nickname of Leather Apron. With a previous stabbing offense and threatening behavior towards prostitutes, he would have been a perfect stereotypical fit and was subsequently arrested on suspicion. But cast-iron alibis and witnesses ruled him out as a suspect, as he wasn't in Whitechapel on the nights of 2 of the murders. After fleeing persecution in Russia and Poland, many Jews had recently settled in the East End of London, and their arrival in an already overcrowded and impoverished area during a time of economic depression and high unemployment increased social tension, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. There had been frequent demonstrations and public disorder, even a major riot in Trafalgar Square the previous year. And with the popular press publishing sensationalist stories, even bizarre reports that the murders were Jewish ritual killings, rumors spread that the Ripper was a foreigner and a Jew. So policing was increased, not just to catch the murderer, but to prevent public disturbances and violence. The best witness was a young Jewish man called Israel Schwartz, who saw the initial assault, if not the actual murder, of Elizabeth Stride, 15 minutes before her dead body was discovered. Thinking it was a domestic argument, he crossed the street to avoid it, but the attacker turned and shouted out the word Lipski, the name of a Polish Jew hanged for murder the previous year. So his face would have been clearly visible from a nearby streetlight. Schwartz was later taken to the local mortuary, where he identified the body of the woman he had seen being assaulted, describing the attacker as being around 30 years old, about 5 feet 5 inches, with a heavy build, fair complexion, dark hair, small brown mustache and wide face. The police claimed Schwartz clearly recognized who the suspect was when later confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him and so had to be released. Possibly because he didn't want to condemn a fellow Jew to death, or he feared reprisals against the local Jewish community if a Jew was convicted of the murders. Of all the many suspects over the years, one man stands out as the most likely candidate. Or does he? Aaron Kosminski was a Polish Jew living right at the epicenter of all the murders. A barber by trade, but he hadn't worked for years due to deteriorating mental health problems and abnormal behavior. This included a refusal to wash, accept food from others, and hearing voices, which sounded like he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He was a prime Ripper suspect and closely monitored by the police. His own family described him as being insane since 1885. And after threatening his sister with a knife, they first interned him in the local Mile End Workhouse Infirmary and later committed him to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. A lot of people thought he was the logical suspect and indeed the true Ripper. So, case closed. Well, perhaps not quite. There are still some problems. Aaron Kosminski was interned at the Workhouse Infirmary on the 12th of July 1890, but was released after just 3 days. He wasn't detained again and committed to Colney Hatch Asylum until 4th February 1891. So, apart from 3 days in detention, he was at liberty for over 2 years after the last canonical murder in November 1888. If he really was the Ripper, he must have got over all his homicidal tendencies very suddenly and stopped, which seemed unlikely, especially after the frenzied, methodical work on his last victim. Kosminski was also described as being mainly harmless in the asylum and just sat quietly. And although he lived until 1919, he never admitted to any murders. His only recorded violent incidents were the one-off threat with a knife, not an actual stabbing, and brandishing a chair at an asylum attendant. He also lived with members of his family, who would probably have noticed him returning with bloodstains, especially with his aversion to washing. It was more probable his family had him committed, as they could no longer live with his worsening madness and other habits they found disgusting. Not because they believed he was the Ripper. One report names a different, but similarly named Polish Jew and local bootmaker called Nathan Kaminsky as being the true Jack the Ripper or Leather Apron. He was thrown into Colney Hatch on the 7th December 1888, shortly after the last canonical murder, under the name of David Cohen, a convenient John Doe for any Jewish man they couldn't properly identify, or perhaps didn't want named. Described as being violently antisocial and destructive, he had to be restrained in the asylum and died there the following year in October 1889. He had previously been treated for syphilis. The standard treatment at a time before penicillin was to administer mercury, which can lead to hallucinations and psychosis, the Mad Hatter's disease. Perhaps in his madness, he took revenge for his syphilis by killing prostitutes. So was he really the suspect that Israel Schwartz failed to give evidence against? And the police, under pressure, knowing full well he was the killer they couldn't prosecute, and fearing civil disorder and more violence against Jews if one came to trial, decided to get him incarcerated and throw away the key. So, the Ripper was actually caught and disposed of after all. But hush, hush, and on the QT. They couldn't admit to this or leave any police records, which is why nobody really knows who he was. And later, Kaminsky was confused for Kosminski, himself also a suspect, due to his insanity and the coincidental similarities between the two men with a popular Polish surname. Or was the Ripper someone else entirely? who was never properly identified by anyone. The ferocity and methodical mutilation of his last victim gives a clue to an advanced and deteriorating mental state. He might just simply have died shortly after the last murder. Apart from syphilis, tuberculosis and typhus were common in the 19th century. With poor sanitation and healthcare, hundreds of unidentified people died every year and were buried in unmarked graves. He might just have died alone and was registered unknown.